dear members, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Library of the European Parliament, a space dedicated to ideas, debate, and the pursuit of knowledge. The setting could not be more fitting for today's conversation as we reflect on the nature of leadership, its challenges, its responsibilities, and its enduring impact. Now it's a great honor to introduce two people who actually need no introduction, two leaders who have not only witnessed history but have shaped it. Roberta Metsola, President of the European Parliament, who has steered the institution with conviction, clarity, and unwavering sense of purpose in turbulent times, standing firmly for democracy, the rule of law, and a strong, united Europe. And Sir Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, whose leadership spanned a transformative decade in British and global politics, and now founder and Executive Chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Sir Tony Blair's latest book on leadership, Lessons for the 21st Century, is a candid and insightful reflection on what it takes to lead and to be a leader in an era of complexity and change. In it, he writes, "Leadership is about making decisions when no one else can, seeking the path forward when others hesitate, and carrying the responsibility that others may fear to bear." These words resonate deeply today as leaders across the world navigate pivotal crises that demand action, resilience, and the ability to inspire and unite. The discussion today promises to offer unique insights, both into Sir Tony Blair's reflection on leadership and into how these ideas apply in today's European and global context. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to today's book talk President Roberta Metsola and Sir Tony Blair.
So thank you very much, Anders, and thank you to you all for being here. Tony, thank you for being here. When we met in New York a little bit over 6 months ago, this was an idea that we came up with. And when you immediately said, yes, I'd like to come and discuss my book in the European Parliament, I said, okay, we're going to make it happen. So thank you very much for taking the time. I know your work doesn't often bring you here, so we really appreciate even more that you made it. So since leaving Number 10, you've developed, as we've just been talking, and advising leaders in over 40 countries through the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, helping them navigate challenges and through those challenges to governing. And now you've distilled that experience into what I think is a brilliant book. I've read it. It's called On Leadership, Lessons for the 21st Century. It's essentially a practical know-how in the positions of leadership and those people who occupy them. So I think this book, and I would encourage all the colleagues you here have in front of you, Tony, so ambassadors, members of parliament, commissioners, and different people who represent all the parts of the parliament, members of European Parliament, of course. I think it's insightful, it is very sharply written, it has made me laugh out loud. I think when your son's advice to call in sick rather than to pretend to understand crypto had me very much giggling and looking at what I have at home. And I also recognized a lot of my own experience in your words. So, for instance, how policy is only as good as it is implemented, what it means to deliver, and that is something that we will deal with later. So going into immediately to the first question, and I think the first part would be about the reality of leadership. So you start the book by saying many leaders are not prepared. They're essentially elected, they're thrown into it, they learn just as they go, they arrive, and they get on with it. So in your experience, when you meet a new leader and you're about to give them the first piece of advice, what would it be, and essentially what is the challenge that you see immediately?
Okay, well, Roberta, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here in the European Parliament. Thank you for your leadership, which has been quite exceptional over these past years. And it's a pleasure to be back, actually, in the European Parliament, where my memories are pretty good, mostly. And yeah, so I wrote the book because, that there are plenty of manuals about how to be a CEO or how to be a football coach, right? But none written from the point of view of what it's like to be suddenly put in a position of leadership in government. And, politics is the only walk of life that you can think of where you put someone in a really important job with potentially no qualifications at all. Right, because you win the election, that's your qualification. So the only job I ever held in government was Prime Minister. I mean, I'd never done any government job before, and there I was suddenly as Prime Minister. So, and if you think about it, for a football coach, you never think of, if your football team and you say, well, who's going to be the coach? You say, okay, get me the most enthusiastic fan. You would never do that in any other walk of life. So the thing about governing is that you're putting people into positions of enormous responsibility when, okay, sometimes they've had experience of being ministers, but often they've had either little experience or they've certainly never been in the top position. And so I wanted to write this just from the point of view, and I wrote it myself, right? Just what's it like? Because I remember when I won my landslide victory in 1997, and I went into Downing Street the first morning, the cabinet secretary, who is a very grand person in the British system at that time, slightly less grand nowadays, but, and when I sat down with him, he said to me in that very upper class British way, he said, well done, he said. Then he said, now what? And, the now what is the difficult thing. So what I say to leaders is, you've got to understand your skill set in bringing you to this position is not the skill set you will need to govern, right? Your skill set in coming to power, you've got to be the great persuader. But your skill set when you're sitting in the seat of decision is to be the great CEO. You are a CEO. And therefore, you have to think differently. And you have to think about your priorities. You have to think about policy. It's what I call the 4 Ps: priorities, policy, personnel, performance management. And they're all more difficult than you think. Because in a way, everything's a priority. But you've got to prioritize. What are the things that really, really matter? The policy is really hard. One of the things, when I talk to new leaders, they will often, I'll say to them, what are your policies? And they'll give me a list of things. And I'll say to them, those aren't really policies. They're just ambitions. And ambitions are very easy to have, right? But policies are really hard. And then the personnel, it matters who your team is. Often you inherit a team, or maybe you've got great political people, but politics at a certain level is an intellectual business. What's the right answer? It's intellectual business. And then performance management, which is delivery. So this is why I say to them, sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. You tell them.
So if I can pick on the word delivery. So you say in your book that democracy is the best and highest form of government, but now we live in an era when we must prove it. And you say that essentially comes down to delivery. And I loved how you spent quite a part of your book in saying that, perhaps you were a little bit, I don't think you used the word naive, but when you became Prime Minister, you said, I thought that when I said something was going to happen, I was sure it was going to happen. And in the end, slowly, you realized that it got buried somewhere by a few months later, and then you came back and said, but where is it? And the answer was nowhere to be found. And I think that when it comes to that delivery, you also focus on implementation. In other words, in French, and you call it this in your book, the le suivi, how you actually move from vision to policy to implementation. This is a big challenge we have in this Parliament. We have gone through enormous reforms since the pandemic, and also since we were hit with particularly challenging times, which we knew that we had to justify the decisions we took if we wanted to go and knock on people's doors last 6th to 9th of June, which is when the European elections took place. So we're now in a new mandate, and we're looking back at what we did well, what we could have done better, and what we can fix. Essentially, that's where we find ourselves now, and your advice would be great for us if I give you one aspect to compare. So the United States passed around 3,000 pieces of legislation in the last mandate. We passed around 13,000 pages. And we're now being asked to see the feasibility of that implementation, how much we can follow on that les suivi, how can we make things simpler, how can we essentially tell our citizens that we're doing a good job in making their lives a little bit safer and a little bit fairer. That's what they asked us to do, also a little bit easier. We don't always answer that question. We sometimes hide behind regulation or obstacles or things that we say we cannot fix. But I don't think we're in that position of comfort anymore. And if you can be as tough as possible with us, looking at us also from the outside inwards, you know, what separates governments from driving real change to those who don't and simply fail?
Yeah, it's a big problem. It's the biggest problem because, in a way, European government is all of the problems that an individual government will have, but just a lot more of it, right? And what's the challenge for governments? It's that you have to have a plan and a direction. And if you don't have a clear plan and direction, then what happens is you don't prioritize, so you're doing lots of different things, right? And every time there's a problem, you're regulating. And there are lots of problems, so you're a lot of regulation, right? And if you're not careful, you end up thinking that the regulation is the same as an implementation. You know, and therefore, what's really important is that you decide to focus on your priorities, and insofar as you're regulating, the regulation has to align with what you say is your objective. Right, otherwise it becomes divorced from it. And it happens in governments all over the world. And what it leads to is you think you've dealt with the problem because you've regulated, but that regulation is inconsistent with your bigger objective. Right, and this is where governments get into a difficulty. So if you're looking at Europe today, and you may feel it's legend majesté for a Brit to be lecturing Europe at the moment, given what's happened. But anyway, leave that to one side. I didn't vote for it. Europe's got to decide what its big picture direction really is. Now, you've got the Draghi report, right, which is, I think most people would look at that and say, okay, if you could do that, you're going to get somewhere. So the important thing is, when it comes to regulation, you're not regulating in a way that's going to undermine your ability to deliver that. So if it's all about competitiveness, and that is surely one of the great things Europe needs to do, the regulation's got to be in line with that. If it's about how Europe gains a position in the technology sector, which in my view is vitally important, then you've got to make sure that the policies you're coming out with, the regulation you're doing, supports that objective. And I would say the same on defense or energy or any of the big things that will determine the future. And look, we're going to have a conversation covering many things, but sometimes one of the hardest things in politics is you get, and I say this to leaders that I work with, governing and indeed being in politics is like a conspiracy of distraction. right? Because when you're trying to focus on why you came into politics, what really matters to you, you'll find there's events and crises and scandals and things that take up enormous amounts of your time and prevent you dealing with what you really, really wanted to come in and do. And the important thing, therefore, is for Europe, if we take a step back for a moment, and in recent times, I think Britain and Europe have almost by force of events been cooperating more together in these last weeks than probably, in the last year. Right? Now, what is important is that if you take a step back and you look at the way the world's changing, it's very, very clear that by the middle of this century, you are going to have 3 superpowers, I would say. 2 for sure, probably 3. America, China, and probably India. The question for Europe is not complicated, it's very simple. Can we get our act together sufficiently to sit at that table on equal terms? Because we can't sit at that table on equal terms. The 3 giants are going to do what they want without us. So when you take a step back and you say, well, then what matters to be able to be at that table? What matters is that you've got an economy that's strong enough, and it's got to be strong enough in the technology sector, because that's going to be one of the big determinants of success in the future. That's why the Chinese are putting so much effort into it, leave aside America. And you're going to have military capability, right? And you're going to have the political cohesion to be able to carry the positions you want. So this is why I think when you take a step back and you look at it, politics, when it's about delivery and implementation, it's about the clarity of your plan, and it's about making sure that you're not talking in this direction, but acting in that direction, that the 2 are actually aligned together. And it's very easy in government. I know this because I made this mistake many times myself. You launch the ambition here, but the policy's over there. So that's, I think, the absolutely critical challenge if we want to be powerful enough in an era where otherwise these giants are going to dominate. And one of the things I learned in politics at the highest level is that it's not a nice thing to say, but it's a true thing to say. It's about power, right? And if you don't carry something to the table, the giants tend to sit on everyone else. It's just what giants do. So you don't want them to sit on you. You've got to be big enough so that they can't.
Well, thanks a lot for that. And perhaps to move to technology, as you spent quite a significant part of your book talking about AI and the new technological revolution. And I think also perhaps because of what happened in the last few weeks, more than the last year, to paraphrase what you just said, we've actually found ourselves in a situation where we've had to think of that a little bit faster and say, if we're at the table, what can we bring to it? Because it's also not good just to be at the table. So you're right, we are living through a 21st century revolution, as transformative as the Industrial Revolution, possibly more so. And you make a compelling argument that this is not an issue, but the issue of our time. And the opportunities are, of course, unprecedented, but so are the risks. And on this, I think we both agree. So we've led on AI regulation. We knew that if we didn't do that, either others would do it or we'd simply be far behind. And we're, of course, still in time to see the implementation of that legislation and also how to bridge what we draft in this House with what happens in the world. In other words, with how it's perceived, how our markets perceive it, how our partners perceive it. And I think if we look at the facts, so we have more talent. I think we have even more startups than the US, but we lose them because they have no incentive to stay here. And I think we can really push the narrative that the next AI chapter can be built, written and ended, if you would say, in Europe. So why shouldn't the next Silicon Valley be here? We've been saying this a long time. I remember Angela Merkel making this point, council after council. We need money to do this, but I think most importantly, we need a shift in mindset. And that shift in mindset, because of what's happening everywhere around us, with the speed that it's happening, means that we have no time to lose. So now that I think you're an expert in all things AI, can I say that? I mean, you make a lot of excuses for not being so in the book, but I think with this room you can get away with that. How do we ride the AI wave? How does Europe, how does Britain ride it? How do we ignite a culture of innovation where we frankly haven't for a while?
Yeah, well, no, I'm definitely not an expert. And the story you alluded to earlier, just to tell it, was when I was asked to give a speech on cryptocurrency at some event. And so I phoned my oldest son, who's in the technology business, and said to him, explain cryptocurrency to me. So he tried explaining it. I said, I don't understand what you're talking about. So he then sent me this book whose title, the title of the book was The Idiot's Guide to Cryptocurrency. I still didn't understand it, right? So finally on the morning of the speech, I phone him and say, I'm about to speak to these people. What on earth do I say to them? And he said, tell them you're sick. So no, I don't pretend to be an expert, but I do believe this is just as deep as the 19th century Industrial Revolution, possibly more so. Artificial general intelligence, which is the next step after generative AI, is its own revolution. After that, you'll have artificial superintelligence. I think robotics is going to change manufacturing completely. I think the whole world is going to change, right? What's the problem if you're in government? The problem if you're in government is you kind of say, yeah, okay, that's, wow, all right. But meanwhile, I've got all these problems, and also my public is as worried about technology as it is excited about it. In fact, some people are more worried than they are excited. So you have to explain it to people that this is general purpose technology. So when people say, well, it's got harmful effects, I say, yeah, it's general purpose technology. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. The question is not, to put the point, not whether it's a thing or not. It is a thing, and it's probably the thing, so you have to understand it from government. And it will, in the end, I think, do two things. And this is where, you know, we have got to, from the point of view of people in government, we've got to understand the importance of this. Number one, if we in Europe, including the UK, which has got potentially it's got a strong position in artificial intelligence, but it's got to keep it. If we are not in that technology game, we're not in the game that's going to define this century. So it's a choice, but you've got to be very clear about it. You know, there is a reason why China and India are putting so much effort into it, right? We've got to do that. And actually, the Draghi report sets out some very good things about the capital markets and investment and how you improve venture capital, how we improve our university sector. Again, the UK is very strong, but frankly, you know, if you look at the top 100 universities in the world, Europe's not nearly well enough represented in that. So we've got to think of what are the reforms and changes we need to get into that game and win it. And then the other thing it'll do is it should transform the way government itself operates. I mean, the state as we know it grew out of the Industrial Revolution. So this technology revolution, I think it will change the nature of the state. We have a project in my institute called the Reimagined State, where we're looking at every single aspect of government and how it could be changed and transformed. And I think it will change political parties as well, by the way, in the end. I think what you're seeing all over the Western world, we don't quite notice it yet, is massive political disruption, not in the sense, you know, populist movements and so on, but I think it's a much bigger thing than that. It's that that 19th century industrial revolution that created the modern political parties is itself, it's being supplanted by this technology revolution, and therefore even politics itself in the end will change.
I think, frankly, we started to see that already, also in the type of campaigns that are run, in the types of results that people vote for, and what people want from their elected representatives, especially because the cycle of elections has become so much faster and so much quicker. And if we can sort of focus a little bit on that and on democracy, you also say in your book that Western democracy lacks a clear narrative. You know, we want high growth, we want high living standards, but we're just not sure how to get there. We don't know how we are going to go forward in a debate where we balance out our priorities, even if those have to adapt to time between one election and the other. And I think one experience that I can bring to this conversation is that you have political parties or movements that think that the policy priority of 1 year is going to be the same in 10 years' time. And your people have moved on. You no longer make relevance, you're no longer making sense, but you don't know it. So if we look at Europe, we look back to the last 20 years. So Europe has changed significantly. I like to say Europe has lost more members than it gained in the last decade. However, if we look back 20 years, Poland, my country, we embraced difficult reforms, but they were necessary. Why? Because we needed to economically level up. And I think that has happened in every country that has joined the EU. We now have countries looking towards us for hope, whether for policy, for dreams, for young people to work, travel, and grow. If you look at Ukraine, you have the Western Balkans, you have Moldova. These are countries that look to Europe as their home. And that's something that we should be proud of, because at the end of the day, it's the values that we hold dear, and also the fact that we're an economic model and a value set that works. So if we talk about why people want to believe in Europe, if we also look at how do we continue to be that house on the hill, you know, a clear destination that you need to work in, you know, how do we make people believe in Europe again? How do we make people, especially younger ones, fight for Europe again, in not necessarily in the literal sense? Perhaps, how do we get our mojo back? And I don't mean this in a pessimistic way, but very realistically, you know, how do we sell this narrative as one that was sold to us? This is the reason why I'm here, why a lot of my colleagues are here from a lot of the countries that joined at the time.
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, the first thing we should do is we should be, as you rightly say, Roberta, a little more proud of where we were and where we've come to. I mean, 100 years ago, we were between two world wars fought on the continent of Europe. If you look at improvements in governance and you look around the world for examples, there's probably no better example than how those countries from Eastern Europe and elsewhere who joined the European Union in the last 2 decades made their reforms and changes. And you look at the results. So, you know, those countries in Eastern Europe have a higher standard of living today than they could have imagined 2 or 3 decades ago. And, you know, the important thing to realize as well is, and I will say this to people, when you know, sometimes people have this misunderstanding that Eastern Europe was sort of pulled by Western Europe towards it. You know, that we went and kind of somehow got behind them and pushed them into the European Union. No, they were knocking on the door, right? Because they could see that not just there was a greater level of economic prosperity, but because there were values people wanted, you know, like freedom and like democracy. So, you know, we should start from a position of confidence, but then, you know, the thing is, people always take everything for granted. So if you're looking at a younger generation today, there's no point in telling them about, yeah, okay, 100 years ago we were between world wars, but they don't live 100 years ago, they live here and now. And the challenge, therefore, is to offer a new vision of Europe today that allows people to understand that Europe is not just an ideal, it is the best way to protect your own interests and freedom, right? Because, and this is why I say that democracy's challenge today is delivery. Because ultimately for people, you know, look, all of us will be pretty interested in politics. But one of the things I learned very soon in politics, very early in politics, is that most people don't spend their life thinking about politics, right? Fortunately, otherwise, the world would be a total nightmare. And, you know, one of the most important things I always say, you know, in politics, I say this to young people who want to go into politics, I say, first of all, try and think like a normal person, right? Not like a political person. Normal. You know, I used to, when we debate in cabinet, education, for example, I used to say, don't think about education like a politician. Think about it as a parent or a pupil, and then you'll start to think in the right way. Or if you think about law and order, think about what it's like on your own street. You know, what you want on your own street. And the challenge of democracy today is efficacy. It's that people think our political systems are so slow to adapt. They know we're going through this revolutionary period of change, and we're so slow to adapt that we just can't do it. That's why you get this longing for strongman always government, right? And the longing arises out of the fact that people say, I just want someone who's going to go in there and move things. And this is why the challenge for conventional politics today, and I regard myself in the way as a conventional politician in one sense, in the sense that I think, you know, there are guardrails, there are principles that are important. You know, you do have to have a framework within which people operate. If we don't deal with the grievances people have, then someone's going to come along and exploit those grievances and say, the only way you're going to fix this system is to blow it up. And that's what we're faced with today. And that's why it's really important to understand we're in a new era of politics. And if conventional politics wants to survive, it's got to be much, much more radical. But it's got to be radical and sensible, right? I will say my own side of politics, which is the centre-left side, that the problem is that the radical people aren't sensible and the sensible people aren't radical. And, you know, and what is the instrument? Because what's the problem of all the governments today and what people will say to you on the doorstep? They'll say, you're taxing me too much, you're spending all my money, and where's the product? I've got law and order, you can't control immigration, my healthcare is not good enough, the education system's not good enough. So why are you taking this money from me and spending it? And you're spending a lot of money and you're not delivering, right? So the good news, and that's the bad news, the good news is that with technology, you have the instrument to do a lot of these things much more effectively. I mean, over the next few years, we are going to revolutionize drug discovery through AI, right? Which will mean we'll be able to treat people at a much earlier stage, right? You're going to be able to do diagnostics in a much simpler, much cheaper way so that you can diagnose. In other words, you're going to be able to switch your healthcare system from cure to prevention. It's something people have often talked about. Technology is going to put it within reach. So we've got to be the people putting those ideas forward now. Likewise with law and order, frankly. You know, you still get, for many people in many countries, crime's a real problem. And organized crime is a big problem, right? But you've got organized criminals using technology, and our systems are still in the Stone Age. So but there are ways that you can disrupt organized crime and deal with it much more effectively if you utilize technology. So none of this is to say that you don't have to regulate it and so on, but we have within our power the chance to reform the state today and reimagine it in a fundamental way, because if we don't, then people will get to the stage, and this is what's happening all over the Western world, where they just say, I've had enough. Whoever promises they're going to blow the system up, put them in charge. And that's what's going to happen. That is what's happening, actually. And it's a huge challenge, but we can, we can deal with it if we want to deal with it. But we've got to be prepared. There's got to be an energy and a vitality returned to conventional politics that, frankly, I think has been missing for a long time.
Thank you. So I'm coming to my last question, and then I'll give a couple of colleagues the possibility to share their thoughts with you, if that's okay, Tony. And you make a distinction between leaders as to whether they're in the history books or in the visitors' book. And I love the chapter where you go into how you give advice in terms of how you act as a leader, even when it's very difficult. You also say that a leader needs to generate optimism. You also say no one wants to get on a plane with a depressed pilot. And I think that is a lesson to all of us, those of us who work in the Parliament here, those of us who are elected, as we navigate. You know, the cycle of news is relentless. You also said that you could get bogged down into the day-to-day management of things and losing the big picture. But then it could also be that a crisis hits you and you don't know how to deal with it. Or even more worryingly, you don't have the courage to deal with it because you think somebody else could do it instead of you. You could ignore it, sweep it down the carpet, and somebody else can get to deal with it later. Your citizens will not be prepared for it. I think if there's one lesson I've learned is that, you know, you should never shy away from expressing your position, even if you know the person in front of you might not agree with you, but at least that person knows that you stand for something. So what would your advice be to all of us as we navigate? You've navigated a pretty good number of crises yourself. How do you hold on to that optimism and that sense of tomorrow's another day, we'll wake up and face it, and I think with a great team you can move forward, and at some point those who voted for you will say, actually, I think that's a good thing that is happening.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, by the way, a big disclaimer. One of the things I've discovered since leaving office, it's a lot easier to give the advice. Right? So but, you know, I was with a leader the other day, and I thought, God, the guy's down, he's down. And I finally said to him, have you been reading the comment section again? Never read the comment section. Who gets up in the morning and wants to type in something unpleasant about someone else? People, you get. So the thing is, you've got to realize you're in a new, and I really sympathize with politicians who today in the front line, because it's an ugly business. Because people are like mean, you know. I mean, people can be mean. And I will say, you know, I say to people, look, I know you shouldn't really say this about people, but okay, supposing 1% of the British population is kind of nuts, right? At one level, it's 1%. You think that's not many people, but then you think it's 650,000. Right, that's a lot of people out on social media. So you've got to, and here's the paradox of the way modern politics works. And of this I'm absolutely sure. Not sure of all ways to deal with the social media phenomenon, but I'm sure of this. The public reads it, it generates it, but it also distrusts it. And what they really want are people that appear to know what they're doing, the side of what they're doing, and they are a rock on which the wave breaks. They're not trying to surf the wave the whole time. And that's why what you'll find is that a lot of the leaders that are emerging at the moment are people that just, you can say whatever you like, but that's where they are. And people, you know, that's why I always say you've got to be the person with the plan. If you've got a plan and a clarity of direction, and you believe in it, right? It's important to believe in it, because I always say the most convincing communication comes from someone who actually believes what they're saying, which is not surprising, but it's also just needs to be stated. If you're that person, you've got a chance of bringing people with you. And you know, I've been reading a biography of John Adams, you know, one of the early constitutional fathers in the United States. And he has this great entry in his diary when he's taking part in the debates. And at this point, he's not quite sure where he stands on certain things. And he has this entry saying, I need ballast. Otherwise, I totter in the breeze. In other words, he just sort of, if you don't have if there's not something anchoring you, and it's clear to people that it anchors you, and no one votes for that in the end. I don't think that's not leadership, it's followership, and it never ends well.
So thank you so much for this, Tony. Thank you for being so open. So I'll give the floor to Barry Andrews now, who's the chair of our development committee. He's from Ireland and he's always very clear in what he says, so I'm sure he has a clear answer.
Stand up, of course, yes, thank you.
Happy St. Patrick's Day today.
Well, that was going to be my first comment. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you, Tony and Roberta, and it's great to hear you. Very, very interesting comments. And I was very struck by your point that the sensible people aren't radical, and the radical aren't sensible. And because it's St. Patrick's Day, I'll quote W.B. Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, where he said, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." And it's similar to the sentiments that you've just described. And it really strikes me that you have said we need to be more radical, we need to be concentrating on delivery, we need to really focus on the grievances that people have. A very clear idea of having a plan. And yet, democracy is in retreat for 15, 20 years. We're going through a democratic recession, and it's not getting any better. There's a strong sense that we have a climate crisis narrative, but we don't have a democracy crisis narrative. So what is structurally wrong that we haven't been able to stop this deceleration of democracy, of liberal democracy, of the principles of the rule of law across the world? You know, I think you've exactly put your finger on it. However, we are looking for a direction that will help us to address these issues in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a great question, and happy St. Patrick's Day to you as well. So I've already spoken about technology revolution, but just to say, I think that is the mission. How do you understand it, master it, and harness it? Now, what I always say to people is, let's have a debate about it at least, if that is the mission or not. But you need to have a clear mission, right? So that's one thing. I don't know, situation, Ireland maybe is a little different because you guys have been doing extremely well, but in the UK at the moment, it's a debate about a little tax, more tax here, a little more spending there, a little less tax, a little less spending. I don't think it makes a lot of difference. It's not fundamentally changing the situation. So you need a mission that is geared to fundamental change, and I think that is around this, how you make this technology revolution work. I think the second thing is that conventional politics, climate is a good example of this. All right, I'm going to say something you might not agree with here, but the climate debate has got to be taken out of the hands of the NGOs and campaigners and put in the hands of practical policymakers. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to go into reverse. Because you're not going to be able to say to developing countries, and whatever the historical position, now and even more in times to come, the emissions are going to come from developing countries, notably Southeast Asia, China, and they're going to carry on developing. So unless we show them how they can develop sustainably, you're not going to solve this problem. And frankly, whatever Ireland does, or wherever the UK does, by 2030, we're going to be 2/3 of 1% of global emissions. Right. So, well, at least it wasn't under it. You were, okay. So the thing is, we need to be in the position of having strong solutions to these problems. But I think a lot of people feel that we're more interested in striking positions than we are in hard-headed policy solutions. So, if you take climate finance, so the point is, there's no way you're going to be able to deal with this problem in the developing nations as they emit more because they're developing and they've got to develop. And of course, Africa's not even really begun its huge rise in development, but that will happen. You're going to have to transfer finance to those developing countries. But we don't have a system that does that effectively. So that's where we should be concentrating. We need to make sure that what we've done on solar power, which has reduced dramatically the costs of it, we're now able to do, for example, for sustainable aviation fuel and other things, because the amount of airline travel in the next 20 years is going to double. Okay? So this is the other part of the problem, is that people need to see us taking strong positions that are based on solutions they think will work. Because otherwise, for example, in the UK, I think what people worry about is you're asking us to make these sacrifices but you don't actually have a real policy that's going to work for global emissions. So this is, you know, in the end, and, you know, take the situation with defense. We're going to have to decide what it really takes for Europe to be able to defend itself on its own borders. Because at the moment, we can't. And the reason I think we started European defense, it was 25 years ago, myself and Jacques Chirac. And the reason for that, by the way, was it came out of the Kosovo conflict. Because at the conclusion of that conflict, it was a good conclusion. But I remember saying at the time, and we began this discussion with the French, and I said, but without the Americans, we couldn't have done any of it. So what happens if the Americans don't want to do it? You know, 90% of the assets were American. So in the end, I think we get this political traction back when it's clear we've got answers and where we got the focus on implementation that means that people think, okay, democracy, because most people think democracy, yeah, it's great, we've got the freedom to speak and to stand for election, but is it actually working in a practical way? And we've got to demonstrate that. That's what I think is the key.
Thank you very much. Moving to Eva Meidel. So Eva is one of our, I would say, in-house AI experts. She's one of our MEPs who has worked for a long time in our industry committee, has authored the AI Act together with colleagues. So she's from Bulgaria, and I think she could have some thoughts also give us to share a little bit further to what Tony said earlier. Eva?
Thank you, President. Sir Tony, first of all, thanks for bringing this important discussion to the European Parliament. Sir Tony, I think in a recent interview you talked about if you would be in government today, that the #1 topic you would prioritize is technology. And I think today this was demonstrated very clearly in that conversation so far. Well, as the President mentioned, some of us have been working on this topic for quite a while, but as we are in a public body today, I was wondering how important it is for public institutions to integrate AI and emerging technologies in order to improve efficacy, because you also spoke about that earlier. And are we putting enough effort in doing that across Europe? And that is also linked to the skills question that many of us have been working on as well for quite some time. How important it is among our entrepreneurs and for our competitiveness, but also for making sure that our institutions are prepared to adopt those technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, so look, I think it's deploying AI both in government and in companies is going to be absolutely essential. I think the work you've done actually in the European Parliament on this has been really, really good, and I congratulate you for that. Yeah, but it's a completely new skill set that people need. And, you know, I was talking to the person who led the Singapore information technology, and he told me about that one of the first things he'd done is bring 1,600 engineers into the center of government. So I think you need a completely different skill set in government. That's Singapore, that's a city-state. So I just think we haven't yet fully grasped what will happen. And the changes that are going to happen, you see, the other thing is you're going to have to help people through what will be a vast process of change. So there'll be many professions where, you know, what they do is going to become effectively redundant. I mean, that's just the truth of it. And I mean, I got a presentation on robotics the other day, which I mentioned a little earlier, but I thought that was massive as well. What's coming down the track with this is going to be huge in terms of manufacturing. So, yeah, I think it's also trying to, one of the things my institute works on is putting the policymakers and the change makers in the same room together. And we're working on having a big event of some sort where we get these people together in a very practical way that says, right, here are the 5 things you would do deploying technology in your healthcare system. Here are the things you do in education. This is what you do. For example, your planning system. I mean, the planning system in the UK is a total nightmare, complete nightmare. It's a huge problem for us. But you could automate large parts of that. So I think these are really practical questions we need to get answers to, and then things become a lot easier to do when you're actually down to the brass tacks of it. Yeah.
Okay, last one. Javi Lopez is Vice President of the Parliament. He is from Spain, and he also has a very good podcast that reaches actually quite a lot of people to get the message out on social media. So Javi, perhaps a little bit of the way we communicate and what our biggest challenges are.
Thank you very much, President. Well, it's a pleasure that you are here, Mr. Blair. And well, all the conversation, it was really stimulating, but it was about delivery, policies, the reform of the administration, and take into account that you are one of the best communicators in politics the last 30 years. I think it's interesting to listen to you about how to communicate better Brussels and the European Union. Because our democracy is like institutionally sophisticated, politically consensual, and with a lot of technical regulation. And this is not really appealing for the public opinion. Even here in Brussels, we have our own English, like full of technicalities and like linguistic mistakes. And how to communicate and how to jump the wall between the public opinion and also the Brussels bubble. I think it's interesting to listen to you.
We'll have acronyms here, but we're trying slowly to get rid of them.
But you've got a big communications exercise, have you? What, from the Parliament? You do, yeah.
I mean, we actually spend quite a lot of time trying to see what works in terms of messaging. And there are big differences as well between our audiences in different countries and the different generations. So you mentioned the comments before, the kind of social media that's used, the way that you need to move away from this bubble, as we call ourselves, into each and every village in the whole of Europe that essentially put us where we are last June. And that, I think, more than anything, what we saw last June is that those members who really had a very sort of active communication policy were the ones who people got to know and today are holding accountable. We're still far away from being, let's say, ideal in terms of how we send a message, but we definitely will no longer make it if we continue being the traditional parliament that we've always been, where we know people are going to read our 600-page piece of legislation, sometimes with spelling mistakes and language that could get us into court and in trouble. Our lawyer linguists are not going to be very happy with me when I said that, but I can say it.
Yeah, no, it's... Look, one thing is obviously the means of communication, which has all changed as a result of social media and so on. Okay. But I think because even though Britain's now out of the European Union, obviously it was in the European Union when I was Prime Minister, and I've quite a long experience of European business, as it were. And I think whatever the different means of communicating today, which will be new because of the new methods like social media, there's still nothing more important than the actual message. What is the message? And that's why I think you know, you've got to have something that's very simple, and you've got to repeat it a lot. I don't think that's changed in communications. So, you know, when I was finding my first election, we had this thing, New Labour, New Britain, right? It's pretty simple. So we were getting across the fact that the Labour Party was different and changed because we'd lost 4 elections and therefore, you know, made sense. And I remember when I was first elected Labour leader, there was someone in the audience who got up and said to me, Tony, the British people have now voted against us 4 times. What on earth is wrong with them? That's when I realized we had a big problem. But so, you know, it was simple, right? New Britain coming to a new century, right? I think the message of Europe today, and I think it's reinforced by what's happening on the other side of the world, is the one I was talking about, which is you're going to live in a world where if you want to protect your own interests and values, you're going to have to stick together. And the hard thing about Europe always isn't, and it's natural this, it's an amazing creation in one sense, but in another sense, it's always got the problem that it is, in the end, a collection of individual countries. And no matter how much people want to overcome their differences or their different interests and come together, it's always going to be tricky and difficult. Look, it's difficult enough within a country, but when you're doing it with 27 countries, of course, it's going to be really hard, right? And the risk is, always with Europe, is that you get into an institutional question, which can be, by the way, important. Obviously, it makes a difference. What's qualified majority, what's not qualified majority, and so on. These things aren't irrelevant, but to the public out there, it's like, what? So you've got to keep your mind focused on the big picture. And that big picture today is how does Europe become powerful enough to be able to protect its values and protect its interests, frankly, insofar as is reasonable to get its own way in this world that's going to be dominated by these large single countries. And the reason why you've got countries in Southeast Asia today banding together in ASEAN, right? The reason you've got people coming together in Latin America, the reason even Africa with the Africa Union and trying to create a continental free trade agreement in Africa, and okay, they've got a long, long way to go before all of these institutions, but they're all going to grapple with the same problem, which is even if you're quite a large population country, you're nowhere near as big as India's going to have, what, 1.4 billion people. China over 1 billion people. America's, what, 400 million, will be 400 million. So it's just, that is what we've got to focus on. And what we've got to tell people is a very, very simple thing. And, you know, even outside the European Union, there are still areas where Britain, of course, can cooperate. And this, what's happened in these last weeks, as I say, is Britain and Europe are realizing, leave aside all the structural issues that we're not part of the European Union anymore. We've got to have pillars of cooperation in our own interests. And we've got to be able to communicate this big picture to people in Europe. Because that, in the end, is the reason why the people who want to split Europe or want to end up engaged in, you know, pulling Europe apart, the reason they're wrong is, in the end, if we're not together, we're going to be weaker. And what you're entering into today is a very, very clear position where those big powers are going to say, this is what we want. And if we want to say, well, that's what you want, but this is what we want, we'll be strong enough to say it. Otherwise, they're going to say, we don't even care what you want, because you're not powerful enough. So it's a very, very important thing. And I believe passionately that unless we get our act together collectively and take that message to people, we're going to end up in a situation where the world is going to change very fast in these next years, and we'll find we're not really in the forefront of the technology revolution, even though that's the biggest thing that's happening. We don't have the military capability, even though the world's become a much less certain place. And our own people are going to be saying, yeah, you keep talking about this, but actually you're not doing anything. And this is the challenge, and it's urgent, and it's necessary, and a lot is at stake.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was a great conclusion to what has been a very powerful 1 hour. I know that some of the colleagues would like to also ask questions, but Michael and Sebastian, if you can excuse Sir Tony and us, that we have to close. So your book is a call for action. You've challenged us towards better leadership, towards smarter government, towards a politics that delivers. I think it's a great time, albeit everything, to be governing and to be in a position where we can take decisions. So thank you for lending us a little bit of your thoughts and your experiences, because I think they can really take us far. So you know you're welcome here anytime you want to come back to the European Parliament. We pride ourselves on having the space to think and to challenge ourselves. So thank you very much, and thanks to all of you.